So I'm often asked, or people try to call me an expert in agroforestry, and normally I just say, well, I've studied it for 30 years, but the real experts are the ones out in the field doing it and too busy to talk about it. So I've learned so much through the years from so many farmers. Just a few of them are in these photos here. Some of them are my neighbors. Some of them are in Hawaii, Tonga, Samoa, Ponape. But truly, the expertise in observing nature and interacting with nature in a sustainable, but even more than sustainable, in a regenerative way, is held not in our universities, but in the knowledge base that's been passed down through generations, and in the ways of being, in the language, everything. So it's a little bit perhaps odd that someone growing up from in California would be speaking to you about agroforestry. I think what Danny was saying about value-added products is really important, because what's really new about breadfruit is developing really interesting, wonderful products. The agroforestry part has been done for thousands of years. And so my job is often to just voice things that perhaps people who have been doing it for centuries don't say, and then just have that be kind of a catalyst for moving forward in terms of regenerating our degraded ecosystems. So let me see, I'm trying to advance the slide. That's interesting. Okay, so what I'd like to talk about is how I've come to understand regenerative agroforestry, especially breadfruit-based agroforestry, and how I've been teaching it to others for the past decade. And this is, normally I do a 2-day workshop on this, including a planting on the second day. So I've crammed this all into a very short time period. But I think this is just an introduction, and hopefully we can have a little discussion about advancing in your context these types of principles. But this is a wonderful example from Samoa that I've visited a couple of times through the years. You can see the breadfruit in the middle story, which we call the high story. And these breadfruit trees have been pruned. So for production, you really want to prune your trees. And so they're a little bit shorter than they've just been pruned. So they'll grow out another 2 or 3 meters and then fruit. But above the breadfruit, we have a timber tree, pomuli, and coconuts. And below we have cacao, which is very commonly grown in Samoa, as well as kava and a little bit of noni, and banana. So I'm going to use this as the model for developing a way to think about how these regenerative breadfruit systems work. And what the advantages to farmers is that if we just plant breadfruit and in a monoculture, if you look at this green curve here, that's meant to represent the yield of just a monoculture of breadfruit. You maybe get a little bit of fruit beginning in year 3, and then it goes up to some sort of maximum yield at age 9 or 10. So that's what the farmer will have to wait many years before the investment. Meanwhile, the farmer's taking care of a lot of bare land, and that's a lot of work and expense. So what we're looking at in terms of the economic side of things is growing crops that are completely compatible with the breadfruit monoculture, the space between the trees that you would plant in a monoculture, but give yields very early on. So we have our short-term crops, which in this case, I put the taro, ginger, and turmeric. But even before that, we can grow vegetables. And I've seen that being done quite a lot throughout the Pacific. So vegetables, then taro, ginger, turmeric, and then your papayas and pineapples come on with bananas. Maybe you have an understory of cacao and noni. So through very early on, you're starting to get a good yield. So we're really helping out on the economic side, and that's the innovation. If we're talking about innovation, that farmers have used for a long, long time in agroforestry. And I was so surprised when we started doing the Ulu Breadfruit Project in Hawaii in 2010, how people immediately put the breadfruit into monocultures. That is a mindset that persists, and it's especially concerning with breadfruit because breadfruit trees are reproduced clonally. And in fact, Nairi Zarega told me a few years ago, she does genetic studies on breadfruit, that all breadfruit is identical genetically. All varieties of breadfruit are identical genetically. So we have an issue with if disease crops up, that a non-diverse population is very susceptible to disease. And so what happens in this situation is that we lose organic matter. So the organic matter in the soil is being lost continually. We lose water to evaporation. We lose soil to erosion, and the soil life, which is actually the soil life is what's feeding our food forest or our plants, begins to degrade, and we lose diversity and complexity and resilience of soil. So what we're taught now is that, well, because of this model, we have to add fertilizer, and we have to add water, irrigate, and we have to do all kinds of things to keep the monoculture going and producing something. But we know that this system is a downward spiral. It has huge effects on the global environment. Over 30% or so of all greenhouse gases are released through agricultural production, distribution, and processing. So this is one of the main causes of climate change, which is, as we know, undermining the ability to produce these crops. So let's go back to our, oops, sorry. Oh, I just want to, before we do that. So just to point out, back to the traditional regenerative agroforest, which is very biodiverse and has regenerative characteristics, does many things that we actually care about, including capturing water and nutrients, building soil organic matter, increasing biodiversity, etc. Whereas the monoculture model does none of those things. So I know that researchers have learned a great deal about all kinds of agricultural systems, but I would like to ask the question, who has the authority to actually promote the modern technologies versus the technologies we know are regenerative? And for many years, we talked about sustainability. Sustainability is an old concept now, because sustainability just means we maintain the status. It doesn't get worse. We maintain it and we're okay. But we're actually in a situation now where we need to do a lot of things, including regenerate the environment, regenerate the soils, as Danny was talking about, or Father Pitero, and we need to protect our habitat and biodiversity, and also have a resilient, highly resilient food system. So we need, everything we need to do has to be regenerative. It has to also be economically feasible, and economically feasible might be something we need to adjust our definition of. but we need to do a lot of things. So we need to be more creative and innovative than we've ever been in growing our food. And so the new goal is, I'm going to state it, this is the after many workshops throughout the Pacific, this I think is held to be the new goal of agriculture, is to produce nutritious food for local consumption using methods that regenerate the environment, and the surplus can be exported. Fortunately, breadfruit is one of those things that has tremendous production during certain seasons where local consumption can't even keep up with it. So we want to export that surplus, create value-added products, and so forth. Let's look at the outcomes of regenerative forestry. And by the way, all of this is open to discussion. I continually evaluate, reevaluate. And so these are the outcomes of regenerative agriculture and agroforestry that are agreed upon throughout the world right now, as I've seen it through my study. So number one is improve the soil, build soil fertility, capture more carbon, organic matter in the soil. So building soil, probably the number one regenerative goal, outcome that we're looking for. The next one is to increase water retention. So a lot of the degraded agricultural lands, they don't hold on to water. Water is shed in a big rain, you get erosion, water running off, but you really want to capture that and hold it. And that's what agroforests do, that's what native forests do. Number three, biodiversity. Biodiversity is one of the core of our, that's environmental resilience, and it also gives us so much as humans. The biodiversity contributes to our gut flora and our medicine and our cultural heritage. Number four is ecosystem health. So this is talking about the property of healthy ecosystems that we want to support, which is we want them to be resistant to extremes and disturbances. So climate extremes, of course, are the first ones that come to mind. We want our ecosystems to bounce back from that. And finally, we want to hold on to carbon. That's just another way of saying we want a lot of organic matter. We want to capture sun energy in carbohydrates and in organic material. So I wrote a paper with colleagues a few years ago where we got a chance to really dive into how agroforestry can be broken down into principles that if we follow those principles, we will get the outcomes that I just listed. So those outcomes are rather difficult to measure, but these principles are easier to measure in the field. And so if we follow the principle, we get the outcomes as a result. So the four principles outlined here, they're very simple. Every indigenous person knows these. Integration of trees, shrubs, and other woody plants, perennials. That's very important to, well, it's part of the definition of agroforestry, but it's part of the regenerative cycling of nutrients and supporting the soil life, and all life is based upon our perennials, the trees and the shrubs. So integrating those are number one. Density of planting. We want a dense planting. We don't want an open planting like that monoculture I showed you. We want a dense planting for many reasons, but the main one is we want to maximize our capture of sunlight into organic matter, and that's the sun is feeding everything. So we want density. The next one is multiple species. We want lots and lots of different species, and that gives us many benefits, including resilience, multiple crops. It gives us a portfolio of crops. We want to invest in portfolios, not in just one single thing. And finally, we want multiple stories of plants. So I think due to time, I'm going to speed up a little bit. So let's look at the canopy layers. This is based upon indigenous, not only indigenous agroforestry, but native forest, where we break down the canopy into, at the top, we have in blue, the emergent. Those are the things that are sticking up above everybody else. Then we have the highs. They can take some shade, but not a lot of shade. Below that, we have in yellow, the mediums. They take more shade. And finally, low in red here, they can take a lot of shade. So let's look at our Samoan example here. I'm overlaying those different layers from the diagram. And they're color coded. So the emergents here are the coconut, the pomuli. The high is our breadfruit tree. And the mediums are cacao and banana. And then below that, we have things like kava and a little bit of noni. So now we're beginning to get the beginnings of a design that people can, who are, especially people who are not familiar with agroforestry, can follow what's going on here. And so I'll introduce to you a tool that a free online tool that we developed for designing agroforests based on regenerative principles. But just to point out here, kind of the obvious at this point, that when we plant an open orchard of trees that we expect to be closed canopy in 10 years, we have a lot of space that's really going to waste and taking a lot of work to maintain. So we look at our medium-term planting. So we have our long-term plants on the left-hand diagram here, the medium-term plants in the right-hand diagram. The medium-term plants are filling the space for the first few years. And when we combine them, we end up with these strips of agroforests in rows. They don't have to be straight rows, they can be curved. You can do many different designs, but for the concept, I've depicted them in rows. And between the rows, we have our pathways that we can also use for cropping for short term if we don't need them for access. So here's the design tool. Some of you may have already visited it. It's called Agroforestry X. It actually was made for the Pacific Islands. So the database is full of species that you would find pretty much everywhere in Pacific Islands. And it assists with planning a diverse multi-story food forest there's over 250 species in the database. And so there's a lot of options. You can also put into your design species that aren't in the database. And it helps select planting patterns, select your species based on your environment, determine the pruning sizes. Pruning is very important for maintaining the structure of the food forest and also for organic matter cycling. And also visualizing, this is very important for a lot of people, to visualize how the growth will take place over time. And so there's animations, there's static diagrams, and it helps people learn. It's a learning tool. We also have guides that I co-produced with Diane Rigoni and other authors, one just on breadfruit agroforestry and breadfruit production. These are free downloads that you can get from the websites listed at the bottom here. And I'll just conclude with thanks to PFON and so many other organizations and people who I've worked with through the years. Thank you.